Thank you. So, situation normal, everything must change. I'm going to talk about strategy. I use this slide because normally when I talk about strategy, everybody thinks these people are going to turn up and they're going to tell you about how you should, whatever the latest framework is, like be agile. Agile in your development, agile in your operations, agile for your business, agile for your agile. I'm going to talk about it in terms of Deng Xiaoping, a very famous Chinese economist and leader. He talked about crossing the river by feeling the stones. So what we're going to do is go through what strategy actually means in this lens. So I'm going to start by asking you all a question. What do you think strategy is like in the boardrooms of most companies? Do you think it's a game of chess, or is it alchemy, gut feel, and whatever's popular in the Harvard Business Review? Can you hear me better? Super. So what do you think strategy is like in most companies? Alchemy? Combination of both. Wow, gosh, now it's loud. Okay, so who's for chess? Hands up. Okay, who's for alchemy? Hands up. Oh, dominated by realists. Who's cowardly custard standing in the middle? Sorry. A couple of you. Right, super. So I'm going to go all the way back in time to Sun Tzu. That's where we're going to start. Do you know what Sun Tzu wrote? Art of War. Fantastic. He talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. The first factor is understand your purpose, your moral imperative, why we do something. The next factor is landscape. Understand the environment you're competing in. Then understand the climatic patterns. So in the case of combat, it's the weather. Then understand doctrine, which are universal patterns applicable to everyone. And then you're finally into context-specific gameplay or leadership. Now, we often think of this as a nice linear sort of path. It's not. And the best way of explaining this is one of my favorite games, which is paintball. So you start off in paintball. You want to take the building. The first thing you need to do is understand the landscape, so the obstacles between you and where the building is. Unless you're a bunch of newbies, in which case you just charge in there, you get shot to pieces, epic fail. So if you understand the landscape, you develop some sort of strategy. We're going to do some form of covering fire, and we're going to charge up the middle. You apply some doctrine, you break into 2 small teams, and then you act. And then what happens is the climate changes. Suddenly you're under fire because somebody's hidden in that building with their tactical sniper rifle taking you out at distance. So what happens is doctrine kicks in again, you return fire, you dive for cover, you come up with a new strategic play. We're going to use suppressive fire on the building, and we're going to flank them, and the game continues. Now, the point about this is a cycle. And the best way of understanding the cycle is with the Mad Mage's work, John Boyd. He called it an OODA loop. So you have the game, you observe the environment, you orientate around it, you decide what you're going to do, you act, and then you cycle around. John Boyd was a famous US Air Force pilot. Now, if we combine Sun Tzu and John Boyd together, you end up with the basic strategy cycle. I have my purpose, which is the game, whatever I want to be, the best tea shop in Kent or the best whatever it happens to be. I next understand the landscape, so I observe the environment. I learn about climatic patterns. I use doctrine to organize myself, and then I determine context-specific play and act. It's very simple. Okay, so part of the problem, certainly in business, is this issue of landscape, how we understand our environment. And I'm going to explain this problem using 3 examples: Bjarne Hovsen, Chess World, and Thermopyle. Now, Bjarne Hovsen was a Viking, and This is how Vikings used to navigate with stories. From Herman, head due west towards Half, and you will have sailed north of Hatland, etc. That simply means this. Okay, very simple. Now, Bjarni headed off from Iceland, heading towards Greenland, got blown off course, eventually got control of his boat, apparently found himself off the coast of Newfoundland. Newfoundland wasn't in the right place, according to his story, i.e. there was no Newfoundland. Eventually found himself off the coast of Greenland, but again it was in the wrong place, according to his story, so he started to sail away from it, until he eventually noticed a landscape that he recognized and landed. Now, we've all done this. Every time anybody asks you directions somewhere, if they've got a map, you point out where to go. If they don't have a map, then you give them a story. It's up the road, at the roundabout, take the first left, along the road, take a right, take a left. And they drive off, and you're left with that moment. Did I send them in the right direction? Maybe I'm evil. Maybe they're out there doing a Bjarni Hofsum. So, quick question, what would you use to navigate a ship? A map or a story? Map. That's obvious enough. So, what do we use to help navigate our business? Stories. Perfect. Right, so next example, chess world. I want you to imagine you live in a world where everybody plays chess. And how well you play chess determines your ranking in this world. The thing is, you've never seen a chessboard. All you've seen are these characters on a screen. And you play the game very simply. You press a button, your opponent sees what you've pressed, they counter, you counter, they counter, and the game continues until it's a draw or somebody wins. Now, what will happen is people will take these sequences of moves, these games, put them into their big data systems, and come up with magic secrets of success. So if you press knight, I should respond with rook, queen, bishop. Okay? We'll write books on the secret of the queen and things like that. And then one day you'll play chess against somebody who will see something truly magical. They will see the board. And so you will move and they will counter, and you will move and they will counter, and you will have lost. And you'll be there like, what the fiddlesticks happened there? How did that happen? The first thing you're going to do is copy down that sequence, because obviously it's a magic sequence, and if you press those buttons, you'll win every time. And you'll lose. Then you'll start going, well, maybe it's the speed at which they press the button. Maybe it's cultural. Maybe they're a happy sort of person. Well, you lose because you exist in a low-level situational awareness environment, which is all about sequence copying. They have high levels of context-specific awareness. So, quick question. What would you use to learn in chess? Would you use secrets of success, magic sequences, or context-specific gameplay, understanding of the environment? What would you use? Super. So, what do you use to learn in business? Really? You're not like, oh, look at Uber. We should be like Uber or Amazon. You sure it's not secrets of success? Well, okay. So I'll give you another one, Thermopyle. This is Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general. Now, had a problem. The Persians were invading. And so he had choices. He could defend around Thebes, defend around Athens. What he decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians in along the coastal road into Thermopyle. It's a narrow pass where a small number of troops could defend against a large force. So there was 140,000 Persians, around about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. That's where we get the story. Okay, so I want you to imagine you're part of the Athenian army, so part of the Greek states, and you're standing there, ready for war. Themistocles is in front of you. He's saying, look, I'm going to give you purpose here. We've got to defend against the invading horde of the Persians. And then he says, I actually don't understand the environment. I don't have a map. I don't understand the landscape. But have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. Strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And the threats: the Persians get rid of us. And the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. Okay, so quick question. What would you use to determine and communicate strategy in battle? A map with position and movement, or a magic framework like a 2x2 diagram? Map. You know what's coming. What do you use in business? Excellent. Okay, so if we go back to this question of chess play versus alchemy, if you look at navigation, learning, strategy, and situational awareness, chess, navigation is visual, it's maps. Learning is context-specific. Strategy is all about position and movement, and it's what we describe as a high-level situational awareness environment. Alchemy is more about storytelling, secrets of success, and magic thinking. It's what we call a low-level situational awareness environment. So if you look at something like the military and ask, why does a general bombard a hill? They don't tell you because 67% of other successful generals bombard hills. You know, I read in Generals Weekly that bombing hills was the latest thing. They don't tell you that bombing a hill would make a good story, and they don't say because that's what Uber would do. They use maps. Maps tell you where you can attack. The why of strategy is a relative statement, why here, over there, and then you're into the how, what, and when of action. So military, very much on this side. Business. I'm afraid to say that most of you are over here. Now, normally when I say that to executives, I used to be the CEO of a software company bought by Canon. I built 4 startups. People normally respond, but we do have a strategy. Well, they do. They have strategy documents. When you take one of these documents and you rip out things like implementation details, operational details, purchasing decisions, tactical choices, BYOD, or otherwise known as bring your own disaster. This is all the how, what, and when of action. The why we do stuff tends to be very vague. Most of the time, it's because other people are doing it. So 67% of companies are doing big data, social media, cloud. We should do the same. Or today, because this is a few years old, it's all IoT, VR, and AI. Oh, look, everybody else is doing AI. We must add some AI. So at this point, executives normally get a little bit annoyed. This is my fat cat. I'm not very good at doing angry cat, so I just added some red eyebrows to symbolize them getting angry. And they normally tell me we're not meme copying. Well, that's interesting. So I spent about a year going around listening to executives talk about strategy, and I started to record what I call business-level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAs for short. Here are the common BLAs: digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. And then I took all these strategy documents, combined them together, and created a BLA template. So our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I combined the common BLAs and the BLA templates and auto-generated 64 strategies. So I thought we'd go through them. Number 1. Our strategy is customer focus. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data to build a collaborative, cloud-based ecosystem. Blah, blah, blah. Number 2. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort. Remember, these are all randomly generated gibberish. So I sent this around to about 400 companies. I got 3 basic types of responses. And number 1, this is more or less the exact wording from our business plan. Number 2, I've seen 2 of these used already. My favorite was number 3, are you for hire? So a friend of mine has put this all online. This is strategy as a service. So if you ever need a strategy, just type in the URL. It will automatically generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. And if you don't like it, just press refresh. At this point, people start getting really rather annoyed with me, and they start telling me it's all about execution. Strategy isn't actually that important. Now, this is based on Jamie Dimon's statement. I'd rather have a first-rate execution and a second-rate strategy. Excellent. It's like culture eats strategy for breakfast. Fabulous, nice sound bite. Thing is, I like data. So I spent a bit of time in Silicon Valley, looked at 160 Silicon Valley companies, supposed to be the cutting edge of technology and competition. Looked at the level of strategic play, awareness of their environment versus the use of open, as in open source, open data, open APIs, to manipulate the market to their favor. The bigger the bubbles, the more companies in that group. So low to high situational awareness, low to high in terms of using open to manipulate a market. Now, if execution ruled, these companies would be successful. If strategy rules, these companies would be successful. This is what the data actually looks like. The companies at the top right-hand side had a positive market cap change over a 7-year period. Companies at the bottom had a negative. So at the bottom are companies like open by default. Let's open everything without thinking. Turns out, not a good idea. Much better to open by thinking. So Dimon's doctrine, I'm afraid, as Martin said, is as flawed as it is popular. It's a bit like culture eats strategy for breakfast. Wonderful, unless you want to look at data. At which point, people start getting really angry at me. And so we're now into, well, how come we're successful then? Well, that's a fair point. You know, business is a catfight. And the honest answer is it doesn't matter if you can't see the environment, if you suck, as long as everybody else does, because then you gain no advantage. And there's a wonderful study by Fitzer. This looked at several thousand CEOs and looked at the performance of the CEOs and determined, no different from random chance, you could just get anybody to do the job, basically. Now, at this point, I must admit, conversations tend to get very, very fiery. But if you look at leadership studies today, it's pretty frightening. I mean, this is a Harvard Business Review. This is from 2011 November issue. How earlobes can signify leadership potential. We've degenerated to that sort of level. It's actually of personal interest because I've actually set up a small company which is selling executive earlobes. So if at any point you feel you need to have more leadership potential, you can just buy one of these, add them, you know, and fill the power. But this is the state of management research. Now, obviously, what we want to do is we want to get out of this world of low situational awareness and into this world where we're actually chess playing. But that requires us to have some sort of map of the environment. And normally what happens is people say, we have maps. It's fine, we've got plenty of maps. Let's look at a chessboard. What makes a chessboard useful for learning is that it's visual, it's context-specific, i.e. it's the game at hand. You have position of pieces relative to some sort of anchor. In this case, it's the board. So this piece is at G1, this piece is at C2. And the other thing, critical thing, is that you can see movement. It's the same with a geographical map. It's visual, it's context-specific, so the battle at hand. You can see the position of pieces relative to an anchor. In this case, it's the compass. This is north or south of this. And you can see movement. That's how you learn in military. Now, unfortunately, the diagrams that we use in business don't have those characteristics. Have you ever seen one of these, business process diagram? Right, visual, yes. Context-specific, yes. Position, sort of, relative to an anchor, the customer, just about. Movement, no. Doesn't show you how the environment is changing. From a point of view of a learning tool, it's fairly useless. This is another one, a trend diagram. It's visual. This is another one. This is a tube map diagram. Again, it's visual. It's not context specific. It has no position. It has no movement. Now, at this point, the conversation normally calms down a bit. And the reason for that is now I've given somebody else to blame. The problem is it's the whole of the business schools. We've not been teaching you how to map. So how do you create a map? An organization is a mass of things. People, capital, activities, practices. It's a complex mess. And what we want to do is turn it into some sort of map which we can learn about. So the first thing is organizations consist of value chains. So I took one of my companies, online photo service, back in 2004, relatively small, few million users. It was medium size for those days, but tiny by today's scale. Started off with one of those dreadful box and wire diagrams. Identified what the user need was. That's the anchor. So what did our customers want? Photo storage, printing. From this, determined what the chain of needs are. So each of these components need other components. A website needs a platform needs compute needs power. And that gives me position relative to an anchor. That's a part of the way there. I still don't have movement. So again, it's still fairly useless from the point of view of learning. And the problem is companies don't stand still. So Nokia used to be a paper mill, became a plastics manufacturer. So things are evolving. So somehow we have to capture that movement. So how do components evolve? How do they change? So I know things like electricity appear, like the Parthian battery 400 AD, and I know somehow it evolves and becomes more of a commodity over time. I started off with this piece of work, Everett Rogers, Diffusion of Innovation. So Everett Rogers noticed that things diffuse in society from early adopters to laggards. It was made famous by Geoffrey Moore, who's actually last speaker today. This is the non-cumulative form. Geoffrey Moore added the chasm. Do you all know this stuff? Wonderful, right. So the question I wanted to know was, how do we go from novel to commodity? So I started off going, well, obviously it must be novel over here, and at some point it becomes a commodity. That must be simple. So I took diffusion curves, all different sorts of things, from fridges to the internet. Just picked one, say smartphones, and just asked this question, right? How many people have one? 327 million in the US. 327 million smartphones in the US. How many people? 317 million. Right. Is the smartphone a commodity? What do you think? Yes or no? Yes? Who says yes? Who says no? Wow, that's a real change. Okay, if you go back a few years, just a few years, when this was done, it was more even mix. Bar of gold, does everyone have one in the US? No? Yes? Yeah, well, not anymore, believe me. Okay, is it a commodity? No? Yes. Okay. The point about this is you can't use adoption to actually measure change. Sometimes things become a commodity when 1% of the population have it. Sometimes you have to get everybody owning 2 of something before it becomes a commodity. So there's no simple way of going, at this percentage point it's novel, then it becomes a product, it's a commodity. It doesn't work like that. But I know things appear and diffuse. And I know that somehow a thing appears, it diffuses, and then it evolves, and that thing diffuses. And what I want to know is how things evolve. So I took the Parthian battery, how we improved electricity, and looked at the different diffusion curves for this. And what happens is the first instance appears, it diffuses to 100% of its applicable market, which happens to be a different market to the second thing. The more improved version. It's like a phone and a better phone, a better phone, a better phone. And so everything diffuses to 100% adoption, but of different markets. And they do so over different time spans. So can we actually predict anything? Can't use adoption. Seems I can't use time. Well, here's the good news. We know as things evolve, they become more ubiquitous. We just don't know to what. And we also know they become more certain, more complete, more well understood. So when something appears for the first time, we find it confusing, like the telephone. We used to have to write guides about how to use a telephone, which way to hold it, or electricity provision. You know, this room is equipped with Edison electric light. Do not attempt to light with a match. Use a switch. But over time, we don't have to do this anymore. So I looked at publication types. And what happens is we start off with the wonder of something, like the wonder of radio. Then publications change, and they talk about building construction awareness, so how to build your own crystal radio set. Then they change, and they talk about operation, maintenance, feature differentiation, my radio is better than your radio, etc. And finally, we talk about use, like the radio times. So what I did is I took this point, the point of stability, when we shift from one publication type to another, from operation to use, found out the applicable market, called that the point of ubiquity, then plotted back through history for all different sorts of activities, then overlaid the publication types, and this is what appears. If you look at the ubiquity versus certainty, you start off with the genesis of a new act, custom-built examples, products, rental services, commodity, and utility services. So if you take something like electricity, you start off with the Parthian battery, systems like the Hippolyte Pixie, Siemens generators, eventually Tesla Westinghouse utility provision of electricity, 1886. Start off with computing. Z3, Leo, 1946. Then you get Lions Electronic Office, first products, IBM 650, rental services like Timshare, commodity hardware, and eventually cloud. Everything evolves through that same pattern. Okay, but we need to know causation. In the cat fight that is business, anytime anyone gains a new advantage, some new big gun, like an e-commerce site, everybody else wants to follow suit. We're copying. So we want to keep up. And that drives ubiquity, demand, competition. But at the same time, vendors want to supply this stuff. And anytime a vendor introduces a new thing, like kit and body armor, someone will make a better version. And that drives supply competition, certainty. So what you have is demand and supply competition drive this process of evolution. So now, how do you create a map? It's really simple. You start with an anchor, user needs, understand the value chain, so the position of pieces in terms of being visible to the user and invisible, and then you simply add movement to it, the evolution axis, and you place things in their right spot. That was the first map I created in 2005. Okay, so I have a map. It has visual, context-specific, position, anchor, movement. It's like a chessboard. Exactly like a chessboard. So what? Who cares? Just spent 25 minutes explaining how to map. Well, if you look at this game, purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, leadership, if you understand the landscape, you can start to learn about climatic patterns. So these are the rules that influence the game. So if you've got a map, the first thing you notice, if you take something like platform, it's evolving through competition, becoming more of a utility. And of course, it has a past. So everything on your map is evolving, which is why situation, normal, everything must change is always going to be the case, as long as there's competition. The next thing you discover is the characteristics of the thing change. Doesn't matter whether it's money, penicillin, or computing. It starts off in this uncharted space where it's chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable. It evolves and becomes industrialized, ordered, known, standard, stable, dull. All characteristics change. And because of this, there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all management methods. So agile, in-house development, very strong in this uncharted space because it's all about reducing the cost of change. It's about experimentation. But it's very weak in the industrialized space because you're about reducing deviation now, empires of scale. And of course, those are both weak compared to something like lean in the middle, where you're just learning and trying to reduce waste. Doesn't matter whether we talk about project management or purchasing, there is no one-size-fits-all method. So now we can make a little basic few predictions. I've got my map, 2005. I can anticipate that everything's evolving, very dull. I know that characteristics will change. So if I know climatic patterns, I can start to learn doctrine. So doctrine are universal approaches, applicable everywhere. So HS2, high-speed rail. That's how they're trying to organize themselves, box and wire diagram. They turn it into a map. Suddenly, because they know no one-size-fits-all, they go, right, this stuff we should outsource. Much more utility provision, potentially cloud services. This stuff we need to use off-the-shelf products. This stuff we need to build in-house. So you learn to use appropriate methods. That's the first bit of doctrine. Now, in the past, we had no maps. Because we had no maps, we used to yo-yo. We used to go in government, oh, everything should be Six Sigma. Then, oh, Agile works here, everything should be Agile. Or we used to outsource too much. We used to take entire projects and outsource them with no understanding of what was there, or at least how evolved it was. So some parts would get efficiently treated because they're commodity-like, and some parts would incur excessive change control costs. Now projects would spiral. And we'd end up with a fight with the vendor, and the vendor would explain, it's all our fault, because all the costs came from the bits that we didn't specify correctly. Or we couldn't specify it correctly. It's uncharted. We had to experiment. We had no choice. So quick practice, self-driving car. Anybody experienced with building self-driving cars? Right, so some of you, these probably look quite oldish terms. They probably don't mean much to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the diagram and quickly convert it into Elvish, so we're all on a base level. All right. We outsourced this bit. It was a disaster. Should we outsource this bit? What do you think? Well, we make these decisions with box and wires all the time. Okay, I'm going to turn it into a map. Keep it in Elvish. We outsourced this bit. It was a disaster. Should we outsource this bit? Yes. More of a commodity. Why do we think this was a disaster? Yeah, it's not suitable. Okay. So it's exactly the same diagram, but we've now just added movement. So it now has context. Let me get into more practice. FIST, fast and expensive, simple and tiny. Scale of complexity and goodness, people came up with Lieutenant Colonel Dan Ward, the US Air Force, came up with ideas, added more features, became more useful, more good, added more features, became really complex of no use to anyone, and that's roughly when they built it. And they went, well, that's really bad. What we need is to break it down into small components, make it less complex, more useful. So when they built the Intelligence Agency supercomputer, they applied FIST as doctrine, and they worked out the best way to build this was to go out and buy 1,753 PlayStation 3s and wire them together. Annoyed Sony, these are games delivery vehicles. Apparently they bought a game. They used it for the Harvest Hawk, ideas combat operations, 18 months. Do you know anything about military hardware? That's incredibly fast. So you use appropriate methods, you apply FIST, you break things down into small components. Then you start to organize around it. You use small teams. Amazon calls it 2 pizza, Hire calls it cell-based structures. Then you start to discover that you need, say, engineering over here and engineering here, but they're not the same. So you start to apply multiple attitudes. The structure known as pioneer settler town plan. You discover you need multiple cultures in a single organization. Then you start to design around the concept of evolution. So pioneers develop the novel anew, settlers turn it into useful products, town planners industrialize those components. This stuff is 20 years old. If you want to read more about that, there's a wonderful paper by GCHQ, open source, called Boiling Frogs, which talks about how to organize and cope with radical disruption. Totally, it's all online. So just search GCHQ Boiling Frogs and you'll find it. Wonderful paper. Okay, so I understand my purpose. I now understand the landscape. I understand climatic patterns. I can orientate with doctrine. I now get into the leadership bit. Context-specific gameplay. Okay. So normally, we talk about things like this. Let's Uberize our business. Surge pricing. Is surge pricing context-specific or is it universal? We don't tend to ask those questions. But if you think about surge pricing, is it applicable everywhere? Does it work for, say, funeral parlours? You know, Norman turns up with his mother and you say, sorry, we've had a run on the dead. It's really expensive, you can't bury her. Unfortunately, surge pricing is context-specific. So when you look at your map, you can anticipate, because of common climatic patterns, that things are evolving. You can actually manipulate bits of it, depending upon the context. So you can use open approaches to drive things to more of a commodity. You can use patterns to slow it down. You can use constraints and pricing mechanisms. There's about 35 economic patterns, about 30 different forms of doctrine, about 120 different ways of manipulating a market to your favour. And as you go around that cycle, you learn more and more of these. So we do a little bit more prediction. Another pattern I knew was componentization. That as things evolve, it would enable higher order systems to appear. And I also knew that higher order systems create new sources of value or worth. So electricity enabling radio, television, computing and platform would enable other things to appear. And the point about this is now I can see multiple wares that I can attack. So in 2005, do I build the first compute as a service, platform as a service, or do I wait for somebody else to build them and build new services on top of that? So why here over there? No different from this. Why defend Thebes or block off the streets of Artemisium? And that's an important thing to note about the strategy cycle. There are two whys. The why of purpose, as in defend the Greek states, and the why of strategy, as in movement, why here over there. They are fundamentally different things. So when you get people say you should focus on the why, you need to ask them which why are you talking about. They are not the same. So back in 2005, I decided to build the first platform as a service up the road, Cowper Street. JavaScript-based front and back end, pure utility-based billing, right down to the function. We had a bunch of weak signal techniques. We expected somebody to come out with a compute as a service so we could build on that, infrastructure as a service. I thought it was going to be Google, turned out it was Amazon. We had a particular ecosystem model, particular method of play called innovate, leverage, commoditize, where we would enable other people to build on top of our APIs, monitor the metadata, and use that to identify new patterns to exploit. And I knew we had inertia in the market, so we could drive it with an open approach. And that's an example of context-specific play. So then you act, and that's what we did. We launched the world's first serverless platform as a service in Old Street, Cowper Road, 2005, and it grew like hotcakes. Fantastic. And then Amazon launched, and we were like, yes, brilliant, we're going to rule the world. Unfortunately, the parent company got a big American consultancy firm in who said that cloud was not the future. In fact, the three things we did, cloud, 3D printing and mobile phones as cameras were not the future. The future was 3D television, so we should shut it all down and spend $1 billion there. I had big arguments. They decided to do that. Who owns a 3D TV? Right, Super, there we are. So Zimke was dead. I gave the models to a friend of mine. He built something called Cloud Foundry, uses them with Cloud Foundry. That's worth about 2.8 billion. So it shows that its context-specific play works in different environments and gives me 2.8 billion reasons to hate consultants. So then I went to Ubuntu. Anybody heard of Ubuntu? Super. So we used exactly the same play. We were 2% of the operating system market within 18 months. After we'd mapped the environment, worked out where to attack, spent less than $500,000, we were 70% of all cloud computing. You may have noticed 2008, no one had heard of Ubuntu. Well, very few. 2010, we were everywhere. And they are brilliant at this sort of gameplay. Then I started working on something called Better for Less. So I paper for UK government, which helped in the formation of things like GDS. These days, I do a lot of national level competition and work for multiple governments. That's a quick recap. Strategy is iterative. It's a cycle. It's not a linear path. Purpose, understand your landscape. If you understand your landscape, you can learn climatic patterns, you can learn about doctrine, you can learn about context-specific play. You need to learn by playing the game. You have to act. And really important to understand your environment, which is the thing most of us fail to do. If you don't understand your environment, you are in the world of alchemy. Secrets of success of others. Let's be like Uber, let's be like Amazon. You won't be able to distinguish between what are climatic patterns, doctrine, and what's context-specific. Now, mapping is really simple. It's all Creative Commons. This technique's over 10 years old. Start with user needs, understand your value chain, and simply add movement. And that's all there is to it. So iterative, learn by acting, understand your environment. That's what crossing the river by feeling the stones is all about. And at that point, I'm going to say thank you.
I'm going to ask you to give the audience a challenge, right?
Sure.
Yeah. All right, so while our next speaker is getting ready, we have a question or a challenge for you.
Sure.
So, Simon, what is the big question that you want our audience to think about and discuss with their neighbor?
Okay, so, all right, so good one. In 2004, I was the CEO of a software company, and I realized I was a fake CEO. And I explained why, because 10 years before that, I'd been in the Arts Hotel. The CEO of a company I was working for handed me the strategy document. They'd asked me, does this make sense? I looked at it, I had no clue what I was doing. But being young, I said, oh, yes, it makes sense, because it had words like innovation, ecosystem, and things like that, and thought, well, that looks good. 10 years later, I was the CEO, and we'd written a strategy document. It was pretty much the same as everybody else's, because we had no maps. And so I handed it to one of the people working for me and asked them what did they think of that, and they said, oh, well, that looks good. So I suddenly realized they didn't know what they were talking about, and I didn't know what I was talking about, and I was the CEO. So I felt like I was the fake CEO, that somehow I'd missed all those strategy meetings where they taught me how to understand the landscape and map and the environment. It took me another 5 or 6 years to eventually realize, because I'm a bit slow, that almost everybody else out there is a fake CEO as well. So I suppose that's my question. Are you a fake CEO? Thank you.